Well, hey, I'm Josh here with What's on Disney Plus, and here with my friend Gabriel Greaves. You're a historian,
Yep.
and what's your affiliation in terms of university?
I got my Master's of American Studies from Kennesaw State University, 2016, and I also got my undergraduate there as well. And so my particular focus for my master's from KSU was in Afro-Latino studies, and we dealt with things that pertain to American culture, American folklore, because American studies is an interdisciplinary field. And so, yeah.
Very cool. Well, I'm right, of course. I'm a journalist, and I've learned a lot from Gabriel as someone who both of us happen to love culture, love Disney, and love film and love learning from it. And so, wanted to start us out just asking about what are maybe a couple of your favorite Disney films, and why is it you
Right.
think Disney is something that you care about and is interesting to you?
Let's see, a couple of my favorite Disney films. My favorite film growing up was Beauty and the Beast. That was 1992, I believe, and I was, in second grade. I loved that film because, to me, it showed how people look past the issues that they look past the physical and they see who are when it comes to their spirits. And it was such a powerful film about redemption. Other film besides Beauty and the Beast was Mulan, hands down. One of my favorite Disney films when it came to celebrating heroines who had to prove themselves in times where people will look past them entirely. So, Mulan and Beauty and the Beast were my top two Disney films. Live action ones. Is it Bedroom and Brooms? Is it
Bed knobs and broomsticks.
Bed Knobs and Broomsticks? That was, that one used to be used to be my favorite, but Mary Poppins stole my heart. Jungle Book too. But Mary Poppins, I just like the musical aspect of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's why a lot of those films is hard to choose because they all have such good music.
Yeah,
You know.
I'm kind of a Lion King person for sure. Grew up with that. I probably watched that 200 times as a kid.
Oh, yeah?
I mean,
Yeah.
it was on. Felt like a loop in our living room.
Yeah.
When that VHS came out.
Yeah. King and all that.
Exactly. But I even loved like Oliver and Company and all that kind of stuff. So
forgot
the
about
musical,
Oliver and Company.
it's a great film.
Remember that one?
And Billy Joel in there.
Yep.
But but more recently, I do like a film like Saving Mr. Banks, a
Yeah.
movie that has such a great, I think, strong emotional core to it. Has is telling a story on multiple levels,
Yeah.
and is using, I think, nostalgia in a really interesting way
Right.
to draw you in, but also I think to challenge sometimes your perception and assumptions about a situation.
Right.
And I think more recently Hamilton. I mean,
Yeah.
that's not really a Disney film. I suppose they're distributing it, but but at any rate, it's
Yeah.
it's obviously Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting to me because it does raise such great questions about history. Here you are a historian,
Right.
and I think this popular entertainment,
Yeah.
piece of cultural, work has excited people's interest in the founding era,
Right.
and it's given people it's drawn them back to that time of struggle for our nation when we were founded, why those events matter, and the issues that were discussed and debated then. They're still being discussed and debated now. So, which are some things I wanted to ask you about. What did you think of Hamilton, though?
I really thought I really enjoyed Hamilton, and tell you one of the things I enjoyed about it. I'm a history geek or history buff, and one of the things I loved about Hamilton was that they were able to frame stories about our nation and the different aspects of its founding. They were able to frame it in such a way that made it relevant to people today. I loved how they made certain that all the acting cast were black and brown people. And they also made certain to, use cultural narratives. There was one particular scene with a rap battle where I believe it was Jefferson and Hamilton going back and forth. And watching that, I thought about things I saw in the classroom. Actually, when I did substitute teaching, we actually had discussions about American history in those terms because those are the vehicles that people communicated in. And when it came to seeing how many of these people were young adults, when it came to the founding of a nation, it made me think, how would young adults in that era have communicated? And if it was my time, how would we have communicated these stories? Mm-hmm. So I love that they made it relevant. But I really love how Hamilton, it brought people up to speed with certain historical figures that they may not have heard about. John Lawrence, I love, for example, that they expose people to who he was, because you don't really hear about him as much as you hear about Jefferson or Washington or Benjamin Franklin and several others. And for him to be such a key figure in the story was really powerful. I also like how it humanized the people as well. You don't really hear about how these people had struggles. They actually were human beings who didn't just write about how to have a government. They actually did go through a lot of mess. The same thing that they dealt with mess they had in their lives.
And it's interesting because I mean, people who look like me, they see some people look at that musical and they see that work of cultural art as it is in interpreting history in a very unique and original way. And there's a certain amount of offense to it because they see, oh, it's black and brown people who are being cast in these roles. And, first, I don't know that you're going to find necessarily white people who can rap like that and who can really perform those styles of music as they are performed and written by Lin-Manuel Miranda. Yeah. But, it is saying something, I suppose, about the lack of inclusivity at the time, the lack of representation in the story. And, I know hearing some of the actors talk about, Daveed Diggs and others talk about their, essentially, I didn't necessarily feel like this was my story until now. Yeah. It's something really powerful to that.
I think so, too. And I think, one thing I try to encourage people on is if you're going to talk about, as a black and brown person, if you're going to talk about America's founding, it's critical for you to study the history of patriots and the history of revolutionaries who were black and brown themselves. Growing up, my dad went to schools that centered black education or black studies in the 60s and the 70s. And likewise, when I was younger, I was exposed to black private schools that talked about these things. So to see black founding fathers was not a new concept. Crispus Attucks, for many of those out there who have never heard of him, he was the first black man. He was the first American revolutionary who was shot. And he was a black man who was Native American. Through his mother, he was Wampanoag, and through his father, he came from a specific African tribe. He was one of many black Americans on the front lines. And whether they agreed with the founding fathers or disagreed, they were present. And so when it came to Hamilton, knowing that history, I thought it was powerful that they acknowledged the role that black and brown people would have had. They didn't say that black and brown people were the main ones leading, but the symbolic representation got the conversation started. Mm-hmm. Not only that, but I was glad that they brought forth an opportunity for people to see how governments were developed by people who in many cases did come from marginal backgrounds. Obviously, there were white people who were leading. It was mainly white people who were leading these conversations, and that's a conversation for another day. We could go into a whole other conversation about how many black and brown revolutionary figures were leading protest way before Hamilton. At the same time, Hamilton was doing his thing. But I think it was cool that Hamilton was portrayed with his Caribbean background. It was cool that people portrayed. They were able to see his portrayal in the play, and that portrayal opened up conversation for others to see what American government will look like when it comes to relating to black and brown people and white people in general. Because our stories are intertwined, whether we like it or not.
That's right. It's really good. Well, I think the release of Hamilton, it speaks to this larger issue and an initiative on Disney's part to say we want to be inclusive. We want to be representative of different cultures, different backgrounds. We recognize that this has been much like the American culture sometimes, an American popular entertainment, a white majority situation, and we want to broaden that. And so I think that now they've even taken some of the classics here recently. They have this what they call Stories Matter initiative, where they've put out this disclaimer in front of some of the different classic films. We know Peter Pan and Jungle Book and Aristocats, and a number of them have issues of stereotypes, issues of different cultures that are represented in a sense in a way that is disrespectful, in a way that is minimizing of them, or leaning on some really harmful. Stereotypes that are there. So some people might say, okay, well, this is reflecting some kind of wokeness, some kind of left-leaning ideology or something. How do you respond to folks maybe who kind of just say this is something to dismiss and be wary of?
Let me put it like this. Let me just narrate some of the background that I had, because you know me well enough, and many others do, that I am a 100% Disney geek. I grew up as a single child in the what we call the Disney Renaissance era,
Yeah.
which is from the time that Little Mermaid came out, I believe, in 1989 to
Yep.
1999 with Tarzan. I grew up in that era, you know, so every summer it was a song. And as someone who loves music, that was something that gave me a means of processing. You know, it actually spoke to me. I'll be honest. I was listening to Hunchback of Notre Dame the other day. What's the song that he was singing?
That,
Out there, just for one day out there. All I ask is it's a song that he talks. It's the very beginning of the song, after he wants to go to this parade, the Festival of Fools. I can't believe I'm geeking out, but I love the
great
song.
musical. It's very underrated.
Very underrated, and it's powerful because when I see the villain in this Disney film as someone who felt he was righteous, that felt he was doing God's work, even though he was discriminating against an entire group of people
Yeah.
with the gypsies,
Yeah.
really Romani, you know,
Right.
Roma, if you want to be technical. But when you see films like that and you realize that these films have very deep themes, it helps you to appreciate what the films can represent when it comes to creating cultural conversations. I remember when I watched Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1990, I think 95 is when it came out. And I thought how crazy it was, the main villain, Frollo, while he claimed to love God, he was lusting over a person from a group that he was persecuting.
Uh-huh.
Now, culturally, I grew up knowing about how those things happened to Black Americans when it came to people preaching from the pulpit, doing racist actions, doing bigoted actions, but secretly having affairs with people from the same group. That's a part of history that's happened repeatedly. And watching a movie that brought that to the forefront was a lot
Yeah.
for some people. But for people that knew that cultural history, it was a big deal representation.
Yeah.
And
It
as a
was a film that, here I
Yeah.
used to work at Focus on the Family, and, it was a film that a lot of the right was not very happy with, in the
Yeah.
sense of it seemed to make the religious person out to be the villain, and yet, when you look at some of the songs like "God Bless the Outcasts"
Yeah.
and other things like that,
Yeah.
it's actually it has a very Christian core to it,
Yeah.
in just understanding that religion can be used rightly and understood as a way to follow God and a way to
Yeah.
the pursuit of God, but
Yeah.
it can also be misused as a power structure
Again.
and as a way to to harm someone and to diminish their humanity.
Well, that's why as a kid, I thought it was such a powerful thing for me growing up in a home where we focus on Christ. We made no apologies for that. It spoke to things we heard in the gospel because Jesus spoke out against the Pharisees for doing the same things that Frollo was doing. There was a reason he called them whitewashed tombs, and not just because of their hypocrisy, but because of a lot of the evils they were doing. Remember that issue with the woman caught in the act of adultery? My mom, as a kid, always told me, you know that when they caught her in the act of adultery and try to ask Jesus, should she be stoned or not, keep in mind the words caught in the act. They caught her in the middle of stuff. And most likely they were watching. And that was common amongst men in the aristocracy of Israel, men who were corrupt. They would be involved with the prostitutes and then throw the prostitutes under the bus.
Wow.
So when you keep that in mind, you watch Hunchback of Notre Dame, if you understand that history and the things that have happened historically, you realize that being religious is not the goal and that there are many people who did use religion as a means to cover evil. And Disney, that was just one example of Disney having critical conversations that were ahead of its time.
Yeah.
For me as a kid, I loved the musicals because of how many of them spoke about these issues. I knew about some of the other history too, where the films did not do the best job representing cultures.
Yeah.
But I was also thankful for what they did speak to. And for me, it was difficult as a kid to see how it spoke to certain issues. The film spoke to certain issues, but they also had a lot that was left wanting. Remember, like, they had African films. I remember LeVar Burton. I love watching Reading Rainbow. He had a story called Mufaru's Daughters. It was an African fairy tale. I remember seeing that in the early 90s and thinking about Disney making a film for African people. Lion King came out, and all of my friends in middle school were like, well, you already have a film about African people. You have Lion King. And I thought, okay, this is a problem because they have stories from so many other cultures in Disney, European stories, but they don't have anything speaking to the cultures that I grew up with.
Yeah. And it's interesting how, well, first, the 1994 Lion King, as wonderful as a film as
Yeah.
it is, and I think they did a really wonderful job in the music
Yeah.
and in other aspects that were led by people of color. But
Yeah.
we got to recognize most of the voice cast was certainly
Yeah.
white in that. I
Matthew
mean,
Broderick, I think.
yes, exactly. Certainly most people behind the scenes were, you know. So the new one, I think, tried to do a little bit better job in
Yeah.
terms of the voice cast, et cetera, and reflecting African cultures. But it's interesting even how you've probably seen this issue, and well, maybe I won't go with that direction, but to look at some of the past films, like what particularly to have a disclaimer on the front of Peter Pan, for instance. Why do you think that could be a good conversation starter and something to hopefully raise people's awareness of how Native cultures are represented in that is quite offensive and harmful.
Peter Pan. So when you look at Peter Pan and you see these things, you recognize that Disney has a history. There's been a history of co-opting from cultures, and then in many cases, stereotyping. Putting that disclaimer there helps people to know the history behind why things have been described in such a way, so that you can both understand historically what should not be done. At the same time, you can also understand, why it was done, so that when people watch these films, they know that certain things should no longer be continued. I grew up watching Peter Pan, and I enjoyed the films as a kid, but knowing the way that Native Americans were depicted, that is going to be a problem from here on out. And so while I appreciate what Disney meant to me as a kid, I can also say that I'm glad to have disclaimers that help people understand why these films were offensive to other people. We were talking about it at one point with movies like Aladdin, for example.
Yeah.
I loved Aladdin as a kid when it came out. I did not know, however, when I heard the song, it came out on VHS, right? I didn't know they had edited up the song on the VHS. They changed the language because the original words were, follow me to a place of incredible things where the caravans freely roam, where they cut off your nose if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home. That's a very offensive thing to say about people of Arabic descent. But that was in the movie. And the kids in America were just thankful to have a film that talked about, genies and magic and adventure and comedy. Robin Williams was promoted through that film. But people around the world from Arabic cultures were deeply offended. As kids, we weren't allowed to see some of those things because Disney kept us from seeing the full impact as kids because we were the market. Having these disclaimers helps people to understand the complicated history of Disney. And even with Peter Pan, how does the red man, the way they demonize Native Americans, that shouldn't have happened.
No.
And it gives people the opportunity, again, to learn historically how films were used to perpetuate stereotypes so that we can understand the power of animation, the power of storytelling, and actually be careful in the stories we tell.
Yes, absolutely. Even you've mentioned about Peter Pan. We know that there's some obvious issues of stereotypes and harmful issues there. But even I think one that people celebrate, a film like Princess and the Frog, there are some issues there, which is something I have barely seen myself. But I know that there's some issue in a sense of her. You think about there's this black woman. She's the first Disney black princess. That's a great thing. That's a good thing for representation. And yet think about it in the context of the story. How often is she actually seen as a young black woman?
She's not. And that, I'll be honest, I actually boycotted the film for a while, but when it came out, I was excited when I heard about Disney finally making an animated film after a long gap from the Renaissance era.
Right.
I thought, oh my gosh, they finally found another fairy tale, the Frog Prince. Then when I heard it's going to be the Frog Princess, I thought, okay, where are we going to go with this? And when I finally saw the film, I was so upset. I was upset because, again, she was a princess for only 5-10 minutes of the movie, and the rest of the time she was a frog. And for black people, what that reinforced, many of them liked the movie because they just they were glad that we actually got something. Others said, we've waited for decades to have a black princess. We asked for an authentically black princess to speak for people since we're buying these films and we're buying the merchandise. And you give us a film where the person's only a princess for 10 minutes. The whole dynamic of being disembodied is a form of dismissing people from their cultures. And people in cultures, and even with the film dismissing people, consider Prince Naveen. Every other Disney movie had a prince that was, for the most part, from an actual European nation. technically, if you want to count Aladdin as a film that talks about actual nations, it was a mishmash of several things.
Yeah.
Agrabah is not a real place.
No.
And it's actually a mixture of Southeast Asian cultures and Middle Eastern cultures. But when Prince Naveen was made, people were like, you could give us a African prince. You can give us an African, nation that he's from, but he was from a generic nation. And people said, why is it that in this kind of film we don't even have something that references black culture fully? We get the Bayou, and we get jazz, but we're like, the other Disney films have these world encompassing stories. We got jazz, and we got 10 minutes of both the prince and the princess being frogs. So it didn't really speak to the dignity and the beauty of black culture for the stories, and that is a problem that tends to happen when it comes to black and brown heroines and heroes in films. Films like Cool Runnings, it's not animated, but for a live action film, it is interesting that nearly everyone in that film, I don't know if you know this, but nearly everyone in that film that represented the team was not from Jamaica. Some of you have people that are actually not Jamaican. Speaking, you had several Jamaicans in the island that said, these guys have horrible accents. Why do you choose them to speak for this story?
Yeah, and I know you love the film.
Yeah. I mean, it's a cool film, but it's like I still know what I know. It's like, Dougie Doug, when he was speaking, I was as a young kid, I was like, oh, it's Cool Runnings. We saw that Boys and Girls Club.
Right.
Growing up, though, when I found out that people from Jamaica said that film was very stereotypical, and they didn't actually consult people from Jamaica to actually be in the film and speak Jamaican or patois. Those things are still an issue of cultural leverage, culture being dismissed.
Right, and it's almost like it's commercializing a culture, for the benefit of a general audience family film, which we know Disney is very good at doing. So, we're people who love Disney. We appreciate what they do. No question, we enjoy that culture and mindset of inspiration and of, I think, helping people see beyond their own selves and having a vision for a future and of a bigger world. But I think it's an exciting thing that they are trying to then authentically represent cultures to bring in voices that are actually of these cultures and backgrounds to say, okay, there should be a broader story to tell here.
A lot of Disney films represent fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm. So for people that say we want to have authentic fairy tale, when people were saying we're going to have authentic African fairy tales represented in Disney or authentic indigenous fairy tales, I was one of those people that said, do you really want to go there? Because most of these fairy tales that we did get were nothing close to how they originally were described in the brutality and some of the darker aspects of the stories. Yeah. It is what it is. The original Little Mermaid, she jumped off a boat and took her life. When she didn't get when something went wrong with the prince, that was a part of the original story. Disney edited it up and said, no, let's give her a happy ending. Beauty and the Beast, there were some darker aspects to those stories, to the original story, but Disney edited it up because Disney markets the businessmen of Disney. They are still trying to make a market with this. So when you understand folklore, it's easier to, I won't say excuse stuff, but it's easier to know that this is entertainment. And entertainment isn't always going to be based on accuracy for every single story you have. Absolutely. Just being practical.
So as we close out here, we started talking about Hamilton. I want to end mentioning Hamilton again, which is to say there's a great half-hour documentary called History Has Its Eyes on You. I think is really, I don't know if you've seen it yet, but it is really quite a compelling look at interviewing the cast, interviewing Lin-Manuel Miranda, giving you, I think, an understanding of some of these issues of race, inclusion, representation, why those matter in the context of that musical. So I think it's a good place to start for some people. But I know there's examples where you could go back a little further than Hamilton to understand race as well. I
think it's a good way to go into on what you're saying. Hamilton was a blessing for me because of what they did with representation. But for me, Disney's already done that regarding the TV shows. Many people tend to think about Disney in terms of the movies that came out, but they leave out the history of the animated series. Remember that whole generation with the Disney Afternoon. So Tailspin, we got to give our shout out to Tailspin, Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, Doug when it was taken from Nickelodeon
Sure,
and brought
sure.
on.
Darkwing Duck.
Darkwing Duck. One of the shows that I thoroughly loved as a kid was Gargoyles. It was hailed as one of the most cutting edge shows of its time in the era of Spider-Man, the animated series, and Batman and
Yeah.
X-Men because of its overarching themes and because of the willingness to actually talk about world mythologies and folklore. And with the dynamic of diversity, I'll never forget how it was for me as a kid hearing the lead heroine, Lisa Maza, being someone who was similar to my background as an Afro-Native, Afro-Indigenous. Lisa Maza in the cartoon series was a figure who helped to protect gargoyles and other species, right? But her mother was Nigeria, and her father was Apache.
Wow.
So Disney, from the jump, made it clear that the main heroine was be an Afro-Native, a Black Indigenous woman. The person who voiced the main character, Goliath, was Keith David, a prominent black voice artist. Is that that's the term?
Yeah, voice actor. Yeah.
Voice actor, and also actor in general. He starred in several movies, but they chose a prominent black actor to play the main character and a prominent black woman, Sally Richardson, to play Lisa Maza. I thought it was fascinating. They dealt with issues of racism. They dealt with issues of xenophobia
Yes.
when it came to humanity's hatred of gargoyles.
That's right.
They also talked about things within the culture, like Demona, being a gargoyle who was so fearful of humans and the abuses humans did that she became what she hated.
Wow.
As a side note, what got me hooked on the show was Star Trek. People like LeVar Burton, who led the way in storytelling with Reading Rainbow, he was one of the characters who he was one of the people that voiced characters on the show, along with several other Trekkies.
That's right. Of course, Jonathan Frakes.
Jonathan Frakes, he voiced Xanatos, and
Michael Dorn.
Michael Dorn voiced two characters, and the lady who played Deanna Troy,
Yes.
Marina
Sirtis.
she played Demona.
That's right.
But they all had they all came from a background prior to that with connecting to LeVar Burton when it came to emphasizing storytelling as a form of resistance.
That's right.
As a person in middle school, I can say 100% watching Gargoyles helped me to feel seen, and it helped me to actually engage in studying the different stories from other cultures. And that's not really talked about as much when it comes to talking about the importance of Disney.
Yeah, it's true.
The negatives are talked about more so than the ways that the positives with shows that actually did shift the culture.
Yeah.
So
That's really great, Gabriel. I've appreciated your time and insights, and I think if people should check out Gargoyles. And also, I know there's a really ongoing campaign to see the show revived. The producer of it he really wants to see. He's like, hey, keep binging Gargoyles, I think is the hashtag, because he's really trying to get new seasons of that thing happen. Keith David said he's on board. A lot of people are on board for it. So hopefully we'll see that happen as fans are into it. But thanks for your time. This is, and hope folks stay engaged. I'm on the forums. I know you are as well, Gabriel. What's on Disney Plus? Thank y'all.